Hello, my name is Kim Richter, and we're standing here in Golden Kingdoms at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And I will be taking you through a tour of this exhibition. I am a co-curator of the exhibition together with Joanne Pillsbury from Met and Tim Potts at the J. Paul Getty Museum. I'm also a senior research specialist at the Getty Research Institute, so this was a collaborative exhibition between these three institutions. And I invite all of you who are joining in to post your questions. My colleague here will try to answer some of them. And please tell us where you're joining in from so we have a sense of who's watching and participating in this Facebook Live. So we begin the narrative here with our map of the Americas. And what is key to this exhibition is to understand that we're moving through time and space. So for this exhibition, we didn't just focus on one culture, but we took a broad view of the ancient Americas. And the narrative begins in the Andes in around 2000 BC with the emergence and development of metal and gold working. And then we follow the route of gold northwards via Central America into Mesoamerica, Mesoamerica being a culture area that is today, comprises what is today Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and parts of El Salvador. And so we move north following the route of gold. But we also will, and this is the focus of today's tour, we will focus on the second part of the exhibition, that deals with our counter-narrative, which is that gold was not necessarily always the most highly valued precious material, or in the case of Mesoamerica, wasn't used until very late. So gold working and metal working is introduced only after 650 AD, so much later. We begin this, we'll just do a very quick, brief walkthrough, and we begin here with the earliest gold, excavated gold from the Andes, from a site called Kunturwasi, and you can see this emphasis on sheet metal and the use of the repoussé technique, where the designs are hammered in from the back. We also see here in this exhibition that other materials were precious also in the Andes. So we have textiles, we have objects made from ceramic, with turquoise, with shell. We have our Great Wall of Feathers from the Wari Empire. And we'll just take a quick look at this. This is one of the great masterpieces of metal working from the Moche. The Moche were a culture on the north coast of Peru. This particular ear flare ornament is from the site of Sipan, from the tomb of the Lord of Sipan. This dates to the 7th century AD and was discovered in the 1990s. And what you can see here is a representation of the Lord of Sipan himself in his ear spool. And you can recognize the Lord of Sipan by his crescent-shaped headdress, his crescent-shaped nose ornament. He wears a heavily beaded gold necklace, and the little rattles around on the belt, these were all individual rattles that could be moved, and these are all elements that he actually wore in real life. And we have some examples of these in a case nearby, but I just, as we're passing through here, want to call your attention to this. This is a very important loan from the Tumbas Reales in Sipan from Peru, and from the Ministry of Culture in Peru, and we're very grateful to have this wonderful, iconic piece here. But we will move on. Like I said, we're going to focus on the second half of the exhibition. So here we are walking through Peru, the ancient Peru. We have examples of textiles from the Inca Empire over here, a wonderful royal tunic, the only surviving royal tunic. We walk through here, we have loans from Colombia, from the Museo del Oro in Bogota, a region where gold was worked by many different ancient cultures. Here is one of these nose ornaments from Colombia, and you see the technological and stylistic relationships to that first piece we saw from Kunturwasi, because you see all these little dangling elements that would have moved and lent this piece almost something like a vital force of its own. You can see the clip at the center here. This would have been clipped to the nose, and this huge ornament would have covered the entire face. This is a piece from Malagana in what is today southern Colombia, and really one of these masterpieces. But here I'm focusing today on the counter-narrative of our exhibition, the fact that many cultures focused and preferred other materials, and this is true for Mesoamerican cultures, but here we're actually in what is today what is today Costa Rica, and this is a key region where the land of jade and the land of gold come together. Jade is introduced from Mesoamerica. The only known jade source is the Motagua River Valley in what is today Guatemala. And so it had to be, the raw material had to be imported via long distance from this region, but they also imported objects that were carved in Mesoamerica early on. So from more ancient Mesoamerican cultures such as the Olmecs or the Maya, objects were imported and then recarved in many instances as worn as pendants and ornaments by chiefs in what is today Costa Rica. Later on, around 700 AD, gold is used and becomes more important. This is because gold is much easier to work than jade. Jade is a very hard material, and using tools such as other stones or obsidian, it would have been very hard to carve. But casting gold is relatively much more easy to do. And another key element is that gold and metals in general make sounds. And so we have two ornaments here, these winged avian bird pendants, and these bulbous eyes, those are bells. And so this gives an indication why metal becomes so important eventually in Mesoamerica and Central America. It's this preference for bells, the preference for this metal that can make a sound more so than, for example, the clanking of jade. And so when metalworking is adopted in Mesoamerica, it's primarily for making bells, and the technology that's developed, the technology of creating alloys, is really in order to make bells that sound better. I also, just as a reminder, I invite you to post your questions, tell us where you're from. We're excited that you're joining us today, at least here in LA. It's going on 10 a.m. in the morning, so please keep those questions coming. We also have here some examples from the sacred cenote in Chichen Itza. This is another key site on the Yucatan Peninsula. This is a Maya site, and here the objects that were dredged up from this watery sinkhole, all of these were coming from different parts of Mesoamerica and Central America, and show us how interconnected the Americas were. So this is some wonderful loans from the Peabody Museum and also the Museo Nacional in Mexico City from INA that help us tell the story of the connection between the Americas. But now we're really fully in Mesoamerica and concentrating on our counter-narrative and the most precious material that was valued by these cultures, and that is jade. Jade starts to be used around the Middle Preclassic period, around 700 BC, and especially at the site of La Venta, and these are loans from the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico with Ina, and they show that the really mastery of jade working in this early Olmec culture. The Olmecs were one of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, located on what is today the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And the site is so important because this is a site where jade working archaeologists first find jade objects, and it correlates with the use of intensified maize agriculture. So from the offerings that we see here that were deposited in a tomb in the sacred precinct of La Venta were massive amounts of other green stones, serpentine and other green stones were deposited. We know that jade and other green stones were highly, highly valued. And rulers probably wore them, but they also used them as offerings to the gods. Over here, we have a loan from the Museo de Antropología in Jalapa, and this piece right here makes my point that jade and maize were symbolically linked. Here we have a maize cob, a corn cob, small corn cob that was carved from jade. It was actually discovered only about 3 years ago by a local colleague at Cal State Fullerton. Shout out to Carl Wendt and the other colleagues in Jalapa who worked on this project at Arroyo Pesquero who discovered this. I saw this in the news and I said, I have to have this object. And kindly the museum lent it. And so this shows that jade really represented maize. And this then becomes transformed into iconography for rulers who focus on carving objects with representations of the Olmec maize god, and the Olmec rulers end up wearing some of these icons on their body to emphasize their status. So here we have another one of these massive Olmec stone sculptures. The ear spools might have been made of jade. So we see the use of jade. Her name is Ishmutalahau, and her whole body is adorned with jade. So she wears a netted garment. You can see down here. All of this is associated with a Maya maize god. And so she, by wearing this...
Yeah, they got the jade.
We're back. Okay, sorry for that little interruption, but we're back. There's the joys of internet connections, right? You can all feel our pain here. But I'm glad we're back. So I was just talking about the netted garment of this royal queen and its significance and connections to the Maya maize god. This is a garment that was associated with the Maya maize god. And by wearing this garment, she is claiming to be divine herself. And so she wears arm cuffs made of jade and ear spools made of jade. Her diadem is made of jade. Here you can see her face, her arms coming up. She also has a spondylus shell here as part of her belt ornament. And then as we move further up, she has this wonderful headdress made of feathers. You can see the individually carved feathers. And the feathers at the very top, those are quetzal feathers that would have been iridescent green feathers that were also symbolically related to the color of the green jade. So the Maya were one of the only civilizations in the Americas that had writing. And so this is an example of Maya writing. Epigraphers today can read this writing. I can't, I'm not an expert in this, but I can tell you that this symbol right here, where we see the little face, that spells out her name, Ishmutalahau. The face represents Ish, meaning lady in Mayan. Here is a symbol that represents the site that, with which she was associated with, Mutal, which is thought to be either Tikal or Dos Pilas. And then this symbol up here means Ahau, meaning Lord. So she's the lady, ruler, Lord from Mutal. And what she's doing is she's conjuring up a vision serpent. Here is a serpent that circles up behind her, and from the mouth emerges Awil. This is the deity of lightning and the royal patron god of the Maya. And what you can see coming from the forehead is a torch, and this identifies this deity as Awil. And so, although this relief was surely painted, we don't see any paint left, but we know what these materials were from the study of ceramics, painted ceramics, and so we know that these are jade ornaments. So we know that the Maya dressed themselves lavishly in jade and other precious material in life, but they also did so in death. And here we have a really special loan from the Site Museum in Palenque. Again, this is a generous loan from the Mexican government, from INA. And it is the face mask, the funerary face mask of the Red Queen from Palenque. Palenque is a site located in southern Mexico today. And this is a remarkable find because this queen was buried in a tomb, in a crypt, in a sarcophagus, in a stone sarcophagus, and it is to date the only female burial in a stone sarcophagus known. So this is a really important find. And we call her the Red Queen because she was buried, her whole body was covered in red cinnabar. So this is why she's called the Red Queen. Red cinnabar is a mercury-based substance that was very toxic, but it was thought to preserve the body. And here you can see also the pieces of jade that made up the face mask that was then reconstructed to look like this. Okay, we're back. Here we see a picture of the site of Palenque, and over here is the funerary temple of the great lord of Pacal. This was the Red Queen's husband, one of the greatest Maya lords, because he was a very important art patron. He also lived for many decades and ruled this particular site for many decades. But here is the Red Queen's funerary monument. And so she had her own temple, her own sarcophagus. So there's a stone coffin and her own greenstone mask. Her husband's was made of jade and hers was made of malachite, another precious greenstone. So, and that was a loan that has never left the site before. It's the first time in the United States, so we're very proud to feature it here as part of Golden Kingdoms. Now when we get to post-classic Mesoamerica, so after 900 AD up to the Spanish conquest in 1521, this is a region where, and a time period when there were many different elite cultures that thrived and worked in various precious materials. And here we have the Codex Mendoza. This is a loan from the Bodleian libraries in Oxford, and it is a tribute document painted 20 years after the Spanish conquest, and it shows us all the materials that were considered precious by the Aztecs during the the heyday of the Aztec Empire in the 15th and 16th century. So we see textiles and garments made of feathers and greenstone and feathers as raw materials, indicating what was considered precious to the Aztecs. These were all objects and goods that had to be sent to the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, located in underneath Mexico City. And on the side here, we have a list of little pictographs showing us the names of the provinces of this particular tribute province and the capital is Tochtepec, indicated by a little hill and a rabbit on top. Another group that was very important in post-classic Mesoamerica, even though this is a group that's very much understudied in scholarship today, are the Huastecs. This is my specialty. I'm actually a Huastecóloga, which means a Huastec specialist. And these two sculptures represent the magnificence of Huastec, the Huastec sculptural tradition. The Huastecs were located in what is today the northeast of Mexico, along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in northern Veracruz and southern Tamaulipas and parts of San Luis Potosí. So Tampico is a key Huastec site. And I started my research on this culture because when I was looking through some of the documents, especially the Florentine Codex, a 16th century document that tells us about the ancient cultures of Mesoamerica, these Huastecs were always described as barbarians. They were described as tattooed and scarified, drunken sodomites who went about naked. So of course I had to write my dissertation on these these people. And it turns out, I was curious how they themselves represented themselves, because these accounts are those of the Aztecs who wanted to conquer these Huastec people. And when I started to study them, I realized that in fact they didn't represent themselves this way. They instead represented themselves through these sculptures. Here we have a man. This is probably representing a male ruler. The other sculpture represents a female ruler. And they are lavishly dressed with, here his ear pendants are probably made from shell. He has a magnificent headdress, probably made of feathers, possibly also including gold. Those little round discs, all of those could have been made of gold. He has a lavish collar, probably made from various different precious materials. And then he has a short skirt on that was probably richly embroidered. So we know that the Huastecs actually were master artisans. This was a region that was known for the textile production in Mesoamerica. And the Aztecs got a lot of textiles as tribute once they conquered this region. They tried to repeatedly conquer this region. The Huastecs fended them off, but they wanted to get a hold of the precious materials from this region. And then they engaged in this typical narrative of calling these barbarians. And this is the typical sort of narrative that conquerors develop about other cultures. And if you look over here, we have some of these incredible shell pieces that were carved by Huastec artists that show that they were masters not only in monumental stone sculpture, but also in shell works. So now we head over to the Aztecs, the people who conquered my Huastec people. And we come here to our iconic main image representing the show. This is our serpent libret, a loan from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we see here, this is a lip plug that was worn as a piercing in the lower lip. So this flange over here, this flat flange, this would have been inserted through the piercing in the lower lip. It would have rested against the gums, and then the serpent would have stuck out and from the lower lip and sort of moved as the wearer would have spoken or moved. The tongue is actually retractable. It goes in and out and moves side to side. And this was an ornament that probably only was worn by the Aztec emperor. The emperor's title was Huetlatoani in Nahuatl, and this means great speaker, because when the Aztecs were not always this great empire, they originally were a nomadic tribes, and in those societies, whoever could speak with truth and power and wisdom and with poetry, that was someone who was fit to lead. And then this, of course, became eventually the great leader of the Aztec Empire, the Huaytlatoani. So he probably wore this in as part of dances, and it represents a fire serpent, the weapon of choice of the sun god Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec patron god. Now, at the Templo Mayor, the main Aztec temple located in the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. This is a twin double pyramid structure with a twin temple at the top, dedicated both to Huitzilopochtli, the sun and patron god of the Aztecs, and Tlaloc, the rain god. The archaeologists have been excavating there since 1978, and have found literally tons of precious materials. Turquoise, such as the turquoise disc here, and all the loans that we're seeing here from the Templo Mayor are from the Museo del Templo Mayor in Mexico City, from INA, that are all part of INA. And so they found literally tons of different materials: shells, turquoise, greenstones, sculptures, ceramics, you name it, all sorts of precious materials, flora, fauna, hundreds of different fish species. But the amount of gold that was found, as Leonardo Lopez Lohan, the director of the project and one of our advisory members, has said the amount of gold fits into the palms of his hand. And so over here we have some of these few pieces of gold that have been discovered at the Templo Mayor. So this material was not heavily used in Aztec culture, but it was considered precious and divine. The Aztecs called it Teocuitlatl, which in Nahuatl means divine excrement, or sometimes more humorously translated as holy shit. And here we can see these are all these finely hammered pieces. Some are also cast, both silver and gold. This is actually the little mask in the upper right corner. That's the only silver piece that was ever found at the Templo Mayor. And these were all associated with deities. These are the ornaments of deities. And do we have a question?
We do, Kim. We have a question from Francisco. The question is, where was this artifact supposed to be in your country of origin?
The country of origin of these pieces are what is today Mexico, but back then in the 16th century, when these, or late 15th century, when these were deposited, these were at the Templo Mayor in the great Aztec Empire that occupied what is today central Mexico. So the capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, is buried in what is today Mexico City. So these items all are too small to be worn by a human. These probably were part of an offering representing different deities, and the assemblage here at the center, there's a shell ornament at the bottom. These are all the ornaments associated with the wind god Ihicatl-Quetzalcoatl.
We have another question from Monica. Is it known if they had artisan workshops?
Yes, there were absolutely artisan workshops. And actually, let me come back to this question in just one second, because we know of one that I want to talk about in more detail. So I won't forget that question. I will come back to that in just one second. But I just want to show you what happened to the gold once the Spaniards arrived in 1519 and eventually conquering the Aztec Empire in 1521. They melted all the gold that they found down into bars of gold and shipped it to Europe. So here we have an example of a bar of gold that was melted down from Aztec gold, and then in this case, this one was lost as the Spaniards were actually fleeing because they attacked the Aztecs during a ritual. The Aztecs fought back, and then the Spaniards had to flee the Tenochtitlan, the capital. So this is the fate of many of these gold objects, these Aztec gold objects. But luckily, a few survive in archaeological context. We did not want to end the exhibition with this on the sad note, but you have to come close for this one here, because this from afar looks like a painting, but it's all made of feathers, which is really incredible. So you can see these blue feathers are from the blue cotinga over here. The writing is these green feathers. These are all made from minute little hummingbird feathers. And so we did want to end the story with the Aztec conquest, but show that indigenous artists and indigenous techniques such as these feather mosaics continued after the Spanish conquest. And this piece here was made in a school called San José de los Naturales that was founded by a Franciscan friar, Fray Pedro de Gante, on top of, and here we get to this question of the workshops, on top of the aviary of Moctezuma, to which was attached a feather workshop of the feather workers that were in service of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. And so what we see here is a painting, and because it has this inscription, we know exactly when it was made and for whom. So here we have the date 1539, and then up here we have Pope Paul III, Pontificus Maximus. It was intended as a gift for him. Down here we see the writing says Mexico. And over here, with the script turned around, it was commissioned by Don Diego Alvarado Guanancin, and it was produced at this school established by the Franciscan I just mentioned, Fray Pedro de Gante, and here is mentioned his name. And it was made and commissioned as a gift for Pope Paul III because 2 years earlier in 1537, the Pope had issued a papal bull declaring that the indigenous people were rational human beings. I always have to say this has to sink in for a moment because this is really sort of an important part of history, right? Because ever since the discovery of the Americas, Europeans debated hotly whether the indigenous people of the Americas were actually rational human beings. And so the Pope settled this question once and for all. It had all sorts of legal ramifications. It meant that the indigenous people could own property, they shouldn't be enslaved, even though that still continued, and they could receive the Eucharist, which is part of Mass, and this is the consecrated wafer that's consecrated during Mass. And this painting, if you could zoom out a little bit, it represents the miracle of transubstantiation and early Christian legend from the 6th century. Down here is Pope Gregory, or Saint Gregory, and he's performing Mass in the 6th century in Europe, and he is consecrating the host, and someone in the congregation is doubting this miracle of transubstantiation, this idea that the wafer turns into the blood and body of Christ, the central Catholic doctrine. And as he's performing Mass, the body of Christ miraculously appears on the altar, proving this miracle and converting the doubters in the congregation. Now this is important, an important idea in 6th century Europe, but it becomes important all over again in 16th century Mexico. And this is an important loan from the Musée des Jacobins in Auch in France. Now here we end our tour of the second part of Golden Kingdoms with this painting here. This is a loan from the Prado Museum in Spain. And this is a painting that was done in Quito in 1599. And I see there's a question.
Yeah, the question is from Laura. Is it paint and feathers or just feathers for the last piece?
Oh, the last piece, that was primarily feathers. So we're just going to take a look back here. It's basically all feathers. There might have been some paint used, but really it's all feathers. And if you look on the body of Christ, all the modeling that is done, that is really based on European techniques, all of this is really rendered in feathers. So tiny little pieces of feathers are used in order to create the body of Christ and then model his body. So what I did mention is that this represents sort of now the colonial period, and where indigenous techniques are combined with European techniques. This particular piece is based on a Flemish print. Prints were flooding into the Americas, and the indigenous people were using these prints to learn the European artistic techniques. So thank you for that question. I know it's kind of stunning and amazing to think that all of that was made with feathers. Okay, so let's return to Don Francisco de Arobe and his sons, Pedro and Domingo. So again, this was made in 1599 in Quito, in what is today Ecuador, and it represents 3 sitters who are the sons of an escaped African slave and a Nicaraguan indigenous woman, and they established an independent colony in a region called Esmeraldas in what is today Ecuador. And we included this painting here to show the melding of all these different cultures in the Americas. So indigenous cultures, cultures from Africa, together with the indigenous cultures and European cultures, now in the colonial period in the Americas. And so not only are the individuals represent this mixture of cultures, but also their dress. So we have gold ornaments that evoke the gold ornaments that were created during pre-Hispanic times in this region. They wear these shell necklaces around their necks, but also rough collars from Europe. They have tunics that are typical Andean tunics, woven tunics, but then their mantles are probably made of silk. And again, at this moment, silk is imported from Asia, but then these were made probably in Europe and then brought back to the Americas. So at this point, we have this global trade in luxury goods, bringing sort of this narrative of the trade in luxury goods and the creation of luxury arts in the Americas to sort of this point where now it's global. The other key point is, why was this painting even commissioned? It was commissioned to commemorate the treaty that the Spanish crown sought with these gentlemen, because the Spaniards, of course, did not want to have this independent colony in their lands, but they also wanted to fend off, have their help to fend off Dutch and British pirates who were putting in peril the Spanish trade in luxury goods between Americas and Europe. So we have one more question.
That's a good reminder. That visitors are not allowed.
Yes, and visitors are not allowed to photograph this painting. Thank you for that reminder. We're just, we have special permission to film this piece because you know, we're allowed to use it for promotional purposes and to bring this to the public as part of our exhibition. So this brings our tour to an end. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you see how this exhibition is fundamental to Pacific Standard Time LA. This initiative supported by the Getty Foundation and now currently going on in Los Angeles with over 70 institutions in all of Southern California participating. And even though we're one of only 2 pre-Columbian exhibitions that are part of this initiative, you can see how some of these themes carry over into the exhibitions that are part of Pacific Standard Time, whether it's you know, the presence of Africans and African culture in Latin America, or the emphasis on the study of the materiality of artworks, or an emphasis on women. So hopefully this is sort of an inspiration to come and see our exhibition, but also the other exhibitions that are part of Pacific Standard Time. Thank you again for joining us.